Ronnie James Dio was the heavy metal vocalist and songwriter. Died Sunday, was posted on his official website and confirmed by a publicist.
What they found in Ronnie James Dio's estate will shock you. A locked room. 6 unfinished songs. Boxes of tapes nobody had touched in over a decade. When Ronnie James Dio died in 2010, he left behind more than just a catalog of classic albums. He left behind a studio his own wife couldn't bring herself to walk back into, a name he'd borrowed from a mob associate, and a legacy that would go on to spark one of the most divisive experiments in the history of rock and roll. What happened to everything Ronnie James Dio left behind is stranger, messier, and more emotional than most fans ever realized. Here's the real story. Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010 from stomach cancer, at the age of 67. His wife of decades, Wendy, who had also been his manager and business partner for most of his career, was left to figure out what to do with everything he'd built. Not just the music rights and the touring history, but the physical, unfinished pieces of a career that had been cut short. And one of the first things she did was something almost nobody expected. She closed the door to his home studio and didn't go back inside. Not for years. In interviews later on, she admitted flatly that she hadn't set foot in that room since the day he died. What was sitting behind that door wasn't nothing. According to Wendy, there were roughly 6 songs Ronnie had been working on in his final years, written and partially recorded alongside 2 of his longtime collaborators, guitarist Doug Aldrich and bassist Jimmy Bain. Beyond that, there were mountains of live recordings, concert tapes pulled from shows all over the world, stacked up and essentially forgotten in the chaos of grief. For an artist as prolific and disciplined as Ronnie, that's an enormous amount of material to just sit untouched. But the reason it sat untouched says a lot about who Ronnie actually was as a musician. Wendy has talked about how much of a perfectionist he was, someone who didn't consider a song finished just because the notes existed on tape. If those final recordings didn't sound like something he would have signed off on himself, she wasn't willing to release them just to capitalize on his name while the grief was still fresh. That's a genuinely unusual decision in an industry where posthumous albums built from scraps and half-finished demos tend to get rushed out within a year or 2 of an artist's death, whether the material is actually ready or not. Wendy chose the opposite path, and for a long time, that meant nothing from that studio moved at all. To understand why that restraint mattered so much, it helps to go back to where Ronnie came from, because almost nothing about his early life pointed toward the kind of mythic, larger-than-life persona he'd eventually become known for. He wasn't born with the name Dio. He came into the world as Ronald James Padavona, born on July 10, 1942, and raised in Cortland, New York, the son of Italian-American parents. His father pushed music on him early, starting him on trumpet and French horn, and by the time he was 5 years old he was already performing in front of live audiences, an almost absurd head start for a career that would eventually stretch across 5 decades. For a while, it looked like music might not even be the path he'd end up on. Ronnie actually enrolled at the University at Buffalo with plans to study pharmacology, the kind of stable, respectable career a lot of families in that era hoped their kids would land on instead of chasing something as unpredictable as a music career. But the pull toward performing was stronger, and by the late 1950s he'd made his choice. That's also around the time he adopted the name that would follow him for the rest of his life. He took the name Dio, the Italian word for God, but the actual inspiration behind it wasn't some grand spiritual statement. It came from Johnny Dio, a real organized crime figure of that era whose name had simply stuck in Ronnie's head. It's one of the stranger footnotes in metal history. One of the genre's most mystical, otherworldly frontmen picked his stage name off a mob associate, not a myth or a scripture. His earliest bands sounded nothing like the fire-breathing, dragon-slaying image he'd eventually build. Groups like Ronnie and the Redcaps were rockabilly and doo-wop acts, playing small clubs for barely enough money to cover gas, a world away from the operatic fantasy rock that would define the rest of his career. It wasn't until he formed the band Elf that his sound started shifting toward something heavier, and that shift eventually caught the attention of a guitarist who was about to change the entire trajectory of his life. In 1975, former Deep Purple guitarist Ritchie Blackmore recruited Ronnie to front a new project called Rainbow. On paper, the pairing was an odd one. Blackmore's playing leaned toward classical, almost Baroque influences, while Ronnie brought a taste for fantasy and mythology to the lyrics. Somehow it clicked, and Rainbow became one of the defining bands of early heavy metal, with Ronnie's soaring, operatic voice carrying songs that sounded like they'd been pulled straight out of a fantasy novel. That partnership didn't last though, and the split wasn't the result of one dramatic blow-up. Rainbow's sound started drifting towards something more radio-friendly heading into the album Down to Earth, and Ronnie, whose entire identity as a performer was built around myth and fantasy, simply didn't fit where Blackmore wanted to take the band. It was more of a slow mismatch than a war. Two people who'd built something great together realizing they wanted different things out of it. By the time Down to Earth was released in 1979, Ronnie had already left Rainbow, replaced by a different singer entirely. For most musicians, getting quietly pushed out of a band after a stylistic shift would be the end of the story. For Ronnie, it turned out to be the beginning of the single biggest opportunity of his career, because within months of leaving Rainbow, he was approached about a job that almost nobody thought could actually be pulled off. Later in 1979, Ronnie joined Black Sabbath, stepping in for Ozzy Osbourne, the band's original frontman and to a lot of fans the actual identity of the band itself. At the time, taking that job looked less like an opportunity and more like a trap, a near-impossible task built to fail. Instead, Ronnie completely reshaped what Black Sabbath sounded like. The albums Heaven and Hell in 1980 and Mob Rules in 1981 gave the band a genuine second creative peak, proving Sabbath's sound could survive without its original singer, something almost nobody expected going in. Both records were critically praised at the time and are still regularly ranked among the strongest work the band ever released, Ozzy era included. The same mythological, fantasy-driven lyrical style that hadn't fit with Blackmore's new direction turned out to be exactly what Sabbath needed at that moment. It was also during this stretch that Ronnie introduced the devil horns hand gesture that's now recognized at metal shows everywhere in the world. By his own account, he picked it up from his Italian grandmother, who used it as a superstition to ward off bad luck. He brought it into his live performances, and it eventually spread far beyond Sabbath, becoming one of the most universal symbols in the genre, instantly recognizable to fans regardless of what language they speak. Given how well things were going creatively, you'd expect that lineup to have lasted for years. It didn't. Behind the two albums that had reinvigorated the band, tension was already building, and it wasn't going to stay behind the scenes much longer. Ronnie's exit from Black Sabbath in 1982 came down to a dispute over the mixing of a planned live album. Ronnie and drummer Vinny Appice felt their contributions weren't being represented fairly in the mix their bandmates wanted to release, and rather than compromise, both of them walked. Ronnie went on to form his own band, simply called Dio, and released Holy Diver in 1983 to major solo success, proving he didn't need Sabbath's name to draw an audience. That wasn't the last time Ronnie and Sabbath tried to make things work either. In 1992 he reunited with the band for an album called Dehumanizer, but the same old tensions resurfaced almost immediately, and that reunion produced exactly one record before falling apart again. It did leave behind one odd piece of trivia, though. A song from those sessions called Time Machine ended up on the soundtrack for the comedy film Wayne's World, giving Ronnie an unexpected pop culture footnote in the middle of all the internal band drama. The third reunion attempt looked more promising than the previous two. In 2006, Ronnie reunited again with Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Vinny Appice, touring under the name Heaven and Hell specifically to separate this lineup from the Ozzy-fronted version of Sabbath and avoid any confusion between the two camps. They recorded new material for a compilation called The Dio Years, and by 2009 released a full studio album, The Devil You Know, their first entirely new record together in decades. It was met with strong reviews from critics who hadn't expected this lineup to still have anything left to prove. It was during the tour supporting that album that something was clearly wrong with Ronnie, even if nobody around him fully understood how serious it was yet. He was in real pain some nights, doubled over backstage before walking out to perform full sets anyway, while his own bandmates had no idea how bad things had actually gotten. He and Wendy had already seen a specialist about ongoing digestive issues before the tour began, but the initial tests, including checks on his heart, all came back clear. So the tour continued, all the way to what would turn out to be his final concert, on August 29, 2009 in Atlantic City. Nobody in that room knew it was the last time they'd ever see him perform live. Just months later, in November of 2009, Ronnie was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The first public statement from his camp described it as an early-stage diagnosis, and treatment began right away with hope that he'd be back on stage before long. The reality was harsher than that initial statement suggested. According to bandmate Geezer Butler, by the time doctors actually identified what was wrong, the cancer had already progressed to stage 4 and was inoperable. Ronnie moved to a cancer treatment center in Houston, undergoing aggressive rounds of chemotherapy while continuing to speak publicly about beating the disease. In April of 2010 he made one final public appearance, showing up in person to accept an award for Best Metal Singer, and for fans watching, that appearance sparked real hope that he might actually pull through. He didn't. Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010, at the age of 67, with close friends and family able to say their goodbyes beforehand. That should have been the end of the story. In a lot of ways, it was only the beginning of a much messier one, because figuring out what to do with everything Ronnie built after he was gone turned out to be far more complicated and far more controversial than anyone expected. After his death, Wendy took full control of his legacy, continuing to run the record label and management company the two of them had built together over the years. One of the first major moves was setting up a cancer research and awareness fund in Ronnie's name, which has since raised well over $2 million through annual fundraising events that continue to this day, drawing in musicians and fans who never got the chance to properly say goodbye while he was alive. A tribute album followed years later, featuring major artists covering his songs, with proceeds funneled back into that same cause. Then came the decision that actually split the fanbase. In 2016, a technology company built a hologram of Ronnie, debuting it in front of a crowd of more than 75,000 people at a festival in Germany. A few years after that, the hologram went out on an actual tour, performing alongside a live backing band made up of former Dio and Sabbath collaborators, using real archival vocal recordings pulled from throughout Ronnie's career rather than any kind of synthesized voice. The reaction was brutal in places. The metal publication Kerrang published a piece calling the entire project a cash grab and saying flatly that it needed to stop, arguing it exploited fans' grief and turned a beloved performer's memory into a spectacle. Other outlets ran similar takes, with one former Dio guitarist saying publicly that he doubted Ronnie himself would have wanted any part of it. Wendy defended the project at the time, saying it was intended as a tribute and that the fans who actually attended the shows responded well to it. But privately, the numbers told a different story. The hologram reportedly cost more than $2 million to build, and years later, Wendy admitted that costs still hadn't been recovered. Eventually, the hologram tours were put on hold, with Wendy describing the whole thing as an experiment she wasn't sure she wanted to repeat. Instead, she shifted toward a different approach, using restored multi-camera concert footage of Ronnie from earlier in his career, layered with modern special effects and performed alongside a live band, a version of the show she felt fans would connect with more honestly than a digital projection ever could. That wasn't the only way pieces of Ronnie's archive kept quietly resurfacing after his death. A live recording from a mid-1980s concert was eventually pulled from the vault and released decades after it was originally performed, giving longtime fans an entirely new piece of his catalog they'd never heard before. It's a smaller, quieter example than the hologram controversy, but it points to the same underlying pattern. Pieces of Ronnie's career kept emerging years after he was gone, some celebrated, some controversial, almost none of it planned out in advance. In the years since, his story has kept expanding through more personal avenues as well. A posthumous autobiography, built from his own notes and recollections and completed with the help of a co-writer, gave fans his own account of decades of stories in his own words for the first time. A documentary followed not long after, one that Wendy has said was designed to finally let people understand the man behind the stage persona, since she felt he'd been somewhat overlooked while he was alive to actually appreciate the recognition. Wendy has also had to deal with a different kind of noise over the years, persistent internet rumors claiming that she and Ronnie had secretly separated at some point before his death. She's denied that flatly every time it resurfaces, insisting the two of them were together, married, and working side by side right up until the day he died. It's a strange thing to have to keep correcting years after someone has passed, but it speaks to how much interest and speculation still surrounds his personal life even now, well over a decade later. Away from the business side of things, Wendy has also opened up about how selective Ronnie was with his closest friendships outside the spotlight, describing genuine bonds with a small circle of other larger-than-life frontmen, including Judas Priest's Rob Halford and Motorhead's Lemmy Kilmister. Those relationships apparently ran deeper than the usual industry camaraderie you'd expect between touring musicians who cross paths a few times a year. That closeness became especially clear years later, when Wendy found herself with Lemmy in the hours before he passed away in 2015, a small but telling detail about how tightly knit that particular circle of legendary voices actually was behind all the music. So what does all of this actually add up to? A locked studio that stayed sealed out of respect rather than convenience. A hologram experiment that made real money but couldn't buy back the trust of the fans who felt it went too far. And a catalog of unfinished songs that, as far as public reporting shows, are still sitting exactly where Ronnie left them, waiting for someone to decide whether they're ever meant to be heard. Ronnie James Dio's death in 2010 didn't close the book on his story. If anything, it opened up a much longer, messier chapter about what artists actually owe their legacy, and what the people left behind owe to the artist's own standards, even after they're no longer around to enforce them. If you found this story interesting, let us know in the comments what you think should happen to Ronnie's unfinished material, and subscribe for more deep dives into the true stories behind rock and roll's biggest legends.